How to become the best tank in the world? Well, I don't know, that's a pretty high goal, unlikely to happen for a lot of people, but you can definitely become way better, maybe even one of the best if you start analyzing your logs a little bit more. Yes, today we'll be looking at Warcraft logs, but a little bit more in depth, and we will be using the tank specs as examples to showcase how you can look at certain things, resources, mitigation, and all of that good stuff, uptime, and improve upon them. Yes, no funny business today, because today is a day of learning.
Hey man, I farted.
One day, man, one day! And speaking of farts, how about you subscribe and ring that bell thingy? Come on, come on, come on. Oh, you know it helps, it really helps, and we really appreciate it. Thank you, thank you. I don't want the goddamn video, man. The damage you will take can be broken down into two main damage types, physical and magical. You will mostly take physical damage, which is most of the time damage that can be blocked, dodged, parried, or reduced by armor. This type of damage will normally be mitigated by what your spec does, like blocking for warriors, soaking it with high armor for bears, and so on. Magical is damage that kind of changes its purpose based on how the devs decide to design tankiness in general. It's usually damage that is harder to mitigate and that historically has made or broken tanks before, both in raids and in dungeons. It's not as highly tuned, but it can be problematic. Stuff like spell reflection, anti-magic shell, or demonic tattoos are made to counteract magic damage in different ways, and yes, certain tanks are better at dealing with magic damage. Looking at you, demon hunters, while others like warriors or monks might struggle a bit more overall. Lastly, although not an actual damage type but rather a damage event, tank busters. Tank busters are mechanics that usually are represented by a melee hit or ability casted at the tank that needs to be mitigated properly or it will one-shot the tank. Tank busters are designed to kill tanks that mess up their mitigation game, and for better or worse, hasn't been as prevalent lately like it has been in the past. But there is another version of this where tanks accumulate stacks of a debuff, or the boss accumulates a buff stack that increases its damage to their current target, which normally resets when the boss target is switched. This is mostly to justify having two tanks and to give tanks some semblance of a challenge. And sometimes the attacks that generate said stacks can be considered as mini tank busters, and most of the time require some sort of mitigation like shield block. There are also physical tank busters that cannot be blocked, and you might have to use stuff like shield wall instead, or just be a bear and stack iron furs. Also, there are tank busters that combine physical and magical damage, and you might need two types of mitigation or a generic one like Icebound Fortitude. All of this is supposed to let you know what damage to look for in a log and what you did to mitigate it. The more efficient you can do it, the better your end result will be. And we mentioned mitigation a bunch of times, and I won't go into detail since you should probably know what it means. In the context of logs, you have, let's say, rotational mitigation abilities like Iron Fur, Shield of the Righteous, Demon Spikes, Shield Block, Death Strike, and Shuffle. You normally use these to prevent high physical damage intake, whether it's a tank buster or not. And your goal is to maximize the effectiveness of them during an encounter. You also have big cooldowns like Shield Wall, Dancing Rune Weapon, Metamorphosis, Incarnation, Invoke New Zaw, Ardent Defender, and so on. I'm giving an example for each spec, mostly for clarity, but this is not a compilation of abilities and their purpose, just to clarify. Again, when you look at a log, you want to observe when you or someone else used these, why, and whether or not was it effective. Okay. All of this is good, but what is effective mitigation? One of your goals as a tank is to optimize mitigation for the damage you take. Mitigation can be upfront, like shield block, or after the fact, like frenzy regeneration or death strike. In raids, you want to use them to counter whatever mechanic the boss does that would severely mess you up, cause your healers to burn large amounts of unnecessary mana, or kill you. Let's look at an example with Painsmith. A basic mechanic you will need to look for is Cruciform Axe, which chunks you pretty hard, depending on your gear. Here we have a Blood Decay getting ready to take the hit. To get to this screen, you just open up a log, go to Damage Taken, and select the player you want to observe. Select Timelines, and you get a nice little spread of all of the abilities and when they hit. You see Cruciform Axe here hitting around the 38-second mark into the fight. And what does our Blood Decay boy do? Well, let's change from damage taken to casts and see what he casted going into this ability hitting his face. About a second prior, at around the 37-second mark, the tank casted a Rune Tap for 20% damage reduction in anticipation of the hit. Looking for points in the fight like this where you did or should have used the mitigation will point out how you performed. And yeah, we can discuss the validity of the simple use of Rune Tap, but that's probably for another video. We can look at a Vengeance Demon Hunter as well, casting a Demon Spikes around 2 seconds prior to the ability proccing on his face. Demon Spikes gives you parry, but also gives you armor, and you can translate this into other tanks with shit like Iron Fur and Shield of the Righteous. In dungeons, your goal is to optimize uptime, since you will be the only tank there with no downtime that would permit your abilities to cool down when you don't need to, tank or have them used. Let's take one of my logs as an example, since I do dungeons more than raids, and we can look at an average key of 11 theater in Season 1. Here I will click on my face and swap to buffs. We can look at my shield block uptime and notice it's sitting at 38%-ish, which is actually pretty low. For a prot warrior, you might want it at around 50 to 60% uptime, so already looking at it, I can tell that I want to optimize my shield block uptime a bit more. But that's not enough, because I can just spam shield block on cooldown willy-nilly. We can go back to damage taken and look at the melee row, which is by far the largest damage type any tank is going to take. And if you hover over them, you will see the actual amount of hits that were blocked versus the amount of hits I just took to the face. This counts passive blocks as well, not just ones provided by shield block, granted. The reason I am showing this is for you to see a log that has clear issues with room of improvement. If I want to improve my Prot Warrior game, at least in dungeons, I want to work on those shield block uptimes, among other things most likely. A similar approach we can have for tanks like Prot Paladins, which works slightly different. Sure, you have the passive block, but the main mitigation is Shield of the Righteous and Consecration, staying in it at least. Let's look at someone way higher in the rankings. This tank finished a Sanguine Deaths 25 with, from what it looks like, 9.67 million damage taken in melee attacks. Since Shield of the Righteous gives only armor, it doesn't help against bleeds or magic damage, and it's a buff that you could look to maintain as close to 100% as possible. If you look just above the table, you have a section called Source Auras Filters. In this case, Shield of the Righteous is a buff that stays for a few seconds, and if we click it once in the filter there, it will change the table to show what damage this tank took while shield was up and how much it was mitigated. And you can see that 8.93 million damage was taken while the armor buff was up, which is pretty good all things considered. Actually, around 92% uptime on the mitigation, so fuck yeah. Similarly, if we look at one of my older logs, at the melee damage taken and how much of it was with Shield of the Righteous on, you can see I have around 72% uptime. A big difference, a 20% difference. Also here, what you can do is click the aura filter for the Shield of the Righteous again, and you will notice it will change from having the green outline to having a red one. This tracks data that happened when shield was not on the target. And you can see on this particular log, the tank took 10 melee hits from the boss without Shield of the Righteous on. The tank essentially took 100k in damage that could have been reduced to, I don't know, maybe 80k or less. Shield doesn't scale that great anyway, unfortunately. But that's not the point. The point is that you want to manage your holy power generation in this case to make sure you always have your necessary mitigation up. And that can be a goal for you to always improve upon. Words. It's fine. These can be translated to Iron Fur, Demon Spikes, Fiery Brand, Celestial Brew, and many other things that can tell you how good you played and optimized the effective usage of your cooldowns. Resource is another very important metric to look for and optimize, especially on tanks like Blood Decay, where runic power is basically your lifeline. Blood Decay doesn't have an active mitigation ability like other tanks. Bone Shield is more like a passive, get into the spec entry card kind of thing. And Rune Tap is a mini cooldown that has a weird efficiency when it comes to its usage. Death Strike is what's going to actually help you with mitigating the damage your healer has to heal, not the damage you take. And Death Strike costs runic power. Remember the not upfront mitigation that I mentioned earlier? This is it. To basically check your resource efficiency, you can go to a log again and you select the player and click the resources tab. Here you can select something basic like runic power and see how much it was wasted. If you translate that into death strikes, you can figure out how much mitigation you could have done. Of course, in the case of Death Knights, you also have runes. Since runes regenerate 3 at a time, to be resource efficient, you want to always have 3 or more used up to exploit the regeneration as best as possible. And clearly this factors in rage, energy, and other straightforward things, and you can go even more in depth with looking at how Bone Shield was managed. If charges were wasted, aka you casted Marrow Rends, over-generated Bone Shields, and by extension wasted the value of runes. The weight of these mistakes will add up since normally each Marrow Rend you press is 2 Heart Strikes you don't, making you lose 10 runic power and even up to 30 runic power in AoE with a Heartbreaker talent every time you Marrow Rend poorly. And since a Death Strike is 40 runic power, 4 bad Marrow Rends make you lose out on a Death Strike cast. This cannot be seen in resources, but you can go to casts and click on Marrow Rend or your spec's equivalent ability that generates a buff you want to track. In this log, you can see 2 Marrow Rends casted at the pool and then the next one at the 52-second mark. If you go to buffs, click Bone Shield and scroll to the 52-second mark, you can see that this person dropped Bone Shield and pumped it back up. That's not normally what you want to happen as a Blood Decay, but also there could be reasons for this, like he was forced to stay away from the boss for a prolonged time. Unlikely though. Maybe not letting Bone Shield drop there was a much better play. Same thing, you can look for Shuffle on a Brewmaster Monk and observe the uptime. This is an easier and more straightforward thing to do since this is a buff that has to be on you 100% of the time, at least while you are in combat. I mentioned tank busters earlier, and whatever form they take, knowing what they are is very important. For example, Soul Render has Ruin Blade, which is advisable to be the point where you swap with your co-tank to prevent you from dying after taking one of these hits. A good way to look at how you manage these types of mechanics is by going to damage taken on a log, clicking the person you are interested in, and click the ability you are tracking, Ruin Blade in this case. After this, you can check the Events tab at the top right and see what happened when this ability hit that player. In this case, we can see that the Prot Paladin had his Consecration and Shielded the Righteous up for the first one. No Consecration for the second, which hit him for considerably more damage, Ardent Defender for the next few ones, and Guardian of Ancient Kings plus Spirit Link as well for the last one. And you will also have stuff like Blessing of Protection that will remove the physical damage debuff on you or your even co-tank, provided you are aware that you will also be removing the accumulated threat the target has as well. So no bop when you are the main tank, unless you taunt at the same time, and no, don't do that. We didn't teach you to do that, you didn't hear it from me. Bop who? How these cooldowns are aligned with the mechanic falls onto you, but looking at these types of data implies a premise in which you know exactly what to use and when to use it. Using cooldowns comes with experience and knowledge of the fight. The most basic thing you can do is to open up the dungeon journal and look at what abilities the boss has that will truck you. A more in-depth and responsible way is to look on Tanknotes.com, where all the important tank mechanics and strategies are explained very neatly for each individual spec. Panthea builds that website as one of the biggest tank theory crafters out there. And when speaking of cooldowns and tank busters, there will be mechanics that will want you and your healers to pop something. Think of Pain Suppression or Iron Bark. Like we saw with the Prot Paladin log, the Resto Shaman in that raid popped Spirit Link as well, which is an important thing to point out. Although the talk was mostly about raids, likely you will look on logs more on average for Mythic Plus as well. There are different ways to optimize there and things to look out for. As an example, let's look at some more generic things you want to check, and we can use a bear as an example this time. Let's take Nerf Bear and Duty Man. Duty Man? Come on. One key is a 15 mists, Duty Man having the best log for 15 mists in this case, while the other is a 27 mists. These are two different situations, different players, and very likely different ways and routes they used to approach the dungeon. However, there are still a few constants you can look at. First, you can check the casts tab and see that the 15 druid had a 55% uptime on Iron Fur, while the 27 key bear had a 74% uptime. Similar to before between my log and one of the high prop pallies. 20% is a big difference. A similar situation can be seen at Barkskin or Piel de Corteza. The 15 Duru had a total of 0.3 casts per minute. Hence, Barkskin was cast once every 3 minutes, roughly, since it has a 1 minute cooldown. That means it was kept on cooldown for 2 minutes, while Nerf had a 0.5 casts per minute, meaning once every 2 minutes, keeping it most likely for specific mechanics and gaps in his defensives. Neither of them casted it on cooldown, but if you think yourself dying too much, checking how many times you've casted your defensives is a good way to start. If you go to casts, they had a total of 79% uptime on Iron Fur. That's not too bad, but also not conclusive since Iron Fur has stacks and the number of stacks is also important. But more importantly, you can look at Nerf's, in this case, example of having a 0.5 casts per minute on Barkskin, which is not that bad considering that some of the time he might have had another cooldown up, or he might have been waiting for a bigger pool to pop it, or simply he's been walking through the dungeon and there was no real reason to pop anything in this case. Another reason you might be dying because maybe you didn't have cooldowns is probably because you might be using them wrong by stacking them. There are situations when using multiple defensives at once can be a good thing, but unless you panicked, that should rarely happen. Unless you make some major pulls or simply are out of resources like Rage that could have been used on Iron Furs and Frenzy regions, which, you know, that's a whole different issue. To find out how and if you stacked your defensives poorly, you can go to your log, click your name. We'll be using Duty Man here again as our lab rat. Once in the buffs, scroll down to where your defensives are, defensives that you ideally might not want to stack. Let's take Incarnation, Barkskin, and Survival Instincts for this example. And as a bonus, let's also include the healers, Blessing of Sacrifice, and you can do all of this by hitting the plus sign at the side of the table. Scrolling back up, you'll see a few graphs with a big rectangle over the period when the defensives were active. For instance, we see here that Incarnation was used with Barkskin at the same time once, but otherwise the dude has spread out his defensives and never really popped more than one at a time. Similarly to what I mentioned last time as well, context is important. Every encounter is different, but it is also important to know what to look for and where to find it. This again barely scratched the surface, but good enough to give you a start in not only understanding tank logs better, but understanding tanks and tanking in general better too. A special shout out to Mandel, Moi, and Panthea, who have given their opinions and explained a lot of the things to us for us to be able to make this video very comprehensive and very understandable. There's a lot more to go when it comes to tanking logs and analyzing that stuff. There's like hours and hours and hours of videos that we could probably do. So if you want to learn more and, you know, maybe even get some people to look over your logs, we highly recommend you check the Discord communities for your respective tank spec and chat with the boys and gals there, and you'll surely learn to be a better tank. And as a personal little dessert for you, I know it is for me, check tanknotes.com whenever you aim at tanking, specifically the raids. Panthea does an amazing job at pretty much summarizing all of the things that happen on in Sanctum of Domination in this case, but also for every other raid tier, what tank abilities you should use depending on your spec, what you can take advantage of and exploit, how certain tank specs can be better than others in certain mechanics. It's really cool, and we highly recommend you check that out. And of course, check out the patrons. Woo! Look at the list. I don't know where it is. It's somewhere around here, I guess. But the patrons are pretty fucking awesome, guys. You support the content we do. We really appreciate it. It's kind of trying times with YouTube at the moment. So we're really grateful for all the support that you guys are showing. And if you, the viewer, want to support us a little bit more, maybe you like what we do, maybe you want to see more of this happen, you can check the links down below to our Discord page and of course the Patreon page that I just mentioned, because I was talking about the Patreon page. I don't know why I'm talking about the Discord, but you can find all of the links as well down in the description. Maybe you'll find something that you like. Thank you for watching the video, supporting us, and we'll see you next time.
I've been loving it then, I still love it now. Still, I play WoW. Still, I play WoW. Getting better every day, let me show you how. Cause still, I play WoW. Still, I play WoW. It's getting harder to stay, but at the end of the day, it's a guilty pleasure, so just log in and play. Whether it's classic or retail, I'ma do a /bow. Still, I play WoW.